There we go. So this afternoon we have Sir Llewelyn from our local BBM here in the East Kingdom. He's going to be doing vessel raising for us today. As a reminder to all, this is being recorded, so if you do not want to be seen on video, please X out your video so that way we can go. And I will let you take it away, Llewelyn.
Great. Awesome. Well, let me just wait for this to switch over. Hello, everybody. So I am Sir Llewelyn, currently steward of House Silver Dragon, taking over for Master Farrell while he lays in Odin's sleep. I am going to talk today a little bit about raising, and I heard some people asking earlier, what the heck is raising? So the type of raising that I'm going to be doing today is on bronze, and raising is a process by which we take a flat sheet of metal. It could be steel, bronze, brass, aluminum, whatever, and then we turn that either into a vessel, or we can turn it into a more utilitarian item, such as this helmet top here. This will end up being a sallet, right? But this is raised out of one flat sheet of steel, and then we turn it into something that we can stick on our heads and go out and play with, which is fun. So anybody that knows me for different sparkly and shiny things. I am generally an armorer. I make high-end spring steel armor. I make swords. So in general, I do kind of the flip side of things. I also have a tendency to do a lot of sculpting and casting. So these are all my original sculpted chains. So cast in bronze, pewter, silver, whatever I have hanging about. But today we're going to talk about a process that's a little bit different. So now I said what raising is. Now we're going to talk about how we achieve that. My children, whom I love very much, left all of the caps off of my dry erase markers, so I'm going to mine this a little bit today. So when we get started raising, there are a few different ways that people generally get going. Usually you'll see somebody go and start to sink a vessel, which is distinctly different from raising or dishing, and we'll go over those terms in a moment. Yes. So usually people start by sinking. Sorry, I'm stuck in my head a little bit. And that's the way that we're going to do it today. So how we usually get going is we'll find a good sheet of material. Generally, I like to go with something a little bit heavier. Some people will, start raising a vessel that's, 20 gauge or so. I believe this is 18. So this is a fairly thick piece of bronze. And you want to go with something that is annealed to start with. We're going to go through a couple of courses, and then we're going to have to keep annealing this as we're going on. The material, bronze in particular, has a tendency to work harden. So for anybody that has any questions on terminology or the process or anything that we're doing, just feel free to shout it out as we're going. I have a tendency just to start my class and then run all the way to the end of it without taking a lot of breaks, and I tend to throw a lot of information out. I think, mundanely, I'm a professor of fine art, so I have a tendency to do that in my classes. So as I encourage my students to do, I encourage everybody to do here today too, which is shout out any questions or comments or anything else that you have. So to get going, we find ourselves a good piece of sheet material. We want it to be in an annealed state when we get it. And then the next thing that we're going to do is usually find a center punch. And then you want to kind of plan out what you're making before you go ahead and cut. So this is going to be a small beaker. So the first thing that I thought about was how big I wanted the foot or the base of my beaker to be prior to raising it up, which determined the circle that I ended up cutting out. So if I bring this in here, everybody can see I found a center punch. Can everybody see that? And I just tapped a small divot in the center of a piece of material in order to lay out my disc. And then I took my scribe, which you can get just about anywhere. And then I scribed a small circle on this disc of steel, or on this disc of bronze rather, sorry. And that is going to be the base of my vessel. So the reason that you want to scribe that in and not use Sharpie or anything else is we're going to sink the center of this. Sharpie, you're going to start to lose it after a little while. I have 20 years of being an armorer, and I promise you Sharpie lines are not permanent. They do not last through you know, the mechanical processes of raising and dishing and, you know, planishing. So now, when we get going, we won't lose that little scribed line in there, but it is crucial that you do that first, because as we sink it and we distort it, it will be a lot harder to set that base later on. So you need to make sure that's going. As well, we're going to keep coming back to that center point. So when we start sinking the center of this, you don't want to distort or lose that center point. That is your reference. For those of you, you know, who are carpenters or machinists, you know what that is, right? That is your reference point, your reference edge. We're going to come back to that when we reset our foot afterwards. So to get going, I have some basic tools here. First, this is a raising stake. So we had said, or I had read early on, that a primary component of this class was to create something using very simple basic shop tools. Raising is something that you can do in your shop with simply a pipe and a vise. You don't need any really fancy tools. You can go out and buy incredibly expensive, you know, really nice high-end stakes. You don't really need to get started. Another tool that I recommend, mainly because I make them and sell them, you can also get away in bronze with just cutting a small dish out of a stump, but are these ductile iron dishing forms. So in addition to casting bronze and silver and, you know, pewter and whatever, aluminum, whatever else you want, I also do iron and steel casting. Lately, my iron casting has been going out to a foundry, lovely foundry in Cumberland, Rhode Island. So anyway, so to get going, I'm going to take my piece of bronze and I'm going to find a hammer. You can start with a dishing hammer if you want, or if you don't have that, you can use a ball peen. Most of the hammers that I have, I've made myself, or I have purchased. So there are a lot of specialty hammers. This is one of my armoring hammers. This has a slightly domed surface, and then it has a slightly squashed surface on the back. This is actually a really good raising hammer for armor, but for something that's this thin, I don't want to blow through it. So I'm going to start by tapping the edges of my disc while it's in the dishing form. And the reason I want to start at the edges is because if I start in the center, I am going to start sinking in the center. I'm going to start doing something called dishing, where if you imagine my hands are a flat sheet of metal, if I start hitting them in the center, that center is going to stretch and stretch and stretch. And eventually the center is going to give way. Raising is the opposite process. You will actually thicken areas because you're compressing metal in on itself. So by tapping the metal in and around the edges first, and then going in and tapping the center afterwards, I am already starting to sink the metal into the dishing form. And I'm doing it a little bit more evenly and consistently than most people do when they're dishing. So key thing to remember, this side has to be out, right? Because we're going to be raising this way. So you need to see this. So when you're sinking, that your reference point needs to be face down. So I'm going to go through and start the process. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free. Just go ahead and yell them out. So, voila, I'm done. Candy bowl, right? So I've started on the edge, just doing one complete rotation and making sure that when this is in the dish, this is starting to seat down. So I'm probably going to do 2 rotations, and then I'm going to hit it down in the middle, and then I'm going to do that again, and then I'm going to anneal this really quick. For the sake of time, I have some of my electric kilns going in the background, so that way it's not really loud and you folks can hear what I'm saying as I'm saying it. So when I anneal this, I'm just going to throw this in an electric kiln. It's going to anneal it. I'm going to quench it, and then we're going to keep going. But at home, you can easily use a blowtorch. I've seen people use all kinds of. I saw somebody use a stove one time. It worked pretty well. So bear that in mind. A lot of the specialty tools that I have for this, you know, they're not really necessary to get going. Like when I teach classes on armor making or blade making, you know, I just encourage people to start off with whatever they have. Don't wait for the perfect situation. So now I'm doing a second pass. I'm sorry, I'm kind of off screen as I'm doing this. I'll keep bringing it up to show. So I went around and then into the center in a spiral motion. And now I'm going from the center and I'm going to go all the way back out to the edge. After that, I'm gonna dish it a little bit into the center. I'm gonna just give it a couple extra taps just to sink it a little bit more. For the sake of expediency, it would be best. And as you're hammering, what you're going to hear, if you're doing it correctly, and I'm sure we're all going to be doing it correctly, it's not overly difficult to get that first part down, is you're going to hear the metal start to sound like a saw, right? If you know you see people using a saw as an instrument where they're like, you know, bowing the edge of a saw, and you hear that kind of sound. You're going to hear that as the metal starts to expand and move and change. It's going to change its pitch a little bit. All right, so I've gone around a couple of times. I have this bowl fairly well, sunk at this point. So now I just want to put a few extra hammer strokes right there in the center, and then I'm going to get started on one or two revolutions of raising after we set the foot on this. So a couple more. All right, sunk. So at this point, remember that center reference point in that scribed line that we have in here? This part takes a little faith in your process. So we, from the blind side, the side that we have been sinking, we are going to make a little flat spot. It's a little bit easier to see. So from this side, I'm going to tap the very bottom of this flat. And what that is going to do is that little flat spot that's down here on the bottom is going to be where we kick off actually raising the vessel. You can hear it start to ring a little bit. It'll start to sound like a bell. Maybe that's just my ears from years of doing this. But right now we can see that we have a couple of little flat spots there. So, any questions so far?
For what it's worth, Zoom seems to be muting the hammer sounds.
Oh, I love it.
So you don't have to worry about us being overwhelmed.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. That is that's great information.
Yeah, well, it's not quite so good on Bardic circles when it does the same thing to the instruments.
Oh my goodness, that would be terrible. Yeah, for us, it's really good. I have hearing loss from years and years and years of doing this. I've probably sitting here at my anvil, so I'm very loud in person. So all of you can be thankful that we're doing this online. So I have a few things going on currently with this sunk piece, right? I have these little, wrinkles that are all on the edge. don't worry so much about those. We're going to take those out at the end. You worry about a wrinkle if it becomes very extreme, because that could lead to a crack, especially as this piece begins to work harden. We want to avoid that as much as we possibly can. So we're going to frequently anneal it, and I will go through that process with us as we're working here today. But the very next thing that I'm going to do is, with this little flat spot that I have here on the bottom, I'm going to hook this up to this pipe on a stick. Now, you know, again, all this is a piece of, I don't know, like black pipe that I had kicking around, but I think that the outside diameter of this is maybe 1.5 inches, maybe 1.25 inches, something like that. And it's just a hollow pipe, you know, just welded to a stick that I just set through the hardy hole in my anvil. You can set something like that in any kind of vise, though. And now we're going to get into some specialty tools that you can't really avoid, right? So here, this is a bordering hammer. You know, some people will call this a raising hammer. This isn't really a raising hammer, but this is very similar to a raising hammer. You know, it's almost the exact same thing. So you can see that the hammer face on this is just like a cross peen, which is a very common tool that you'll see. You can buy them at any hardware store. Here's a blacksmith's hammer that has a cross peen on the back, right? You can find these anywhere and get a smaller one. You can also use something called an engineer's hammer, which I have around somewhere. I don't have it over here though, which it looks exactly like this. It's just teeny. It's just really, really, really small. So any of these are going to work. I think what's more important than having, you know, the perfect specialty tool is having a tool that's comfortable for you. You know, when I armor, I use little tiny hammers most of the time. When I'm doing bladesmithing, I use big giant Mondo hammers. You know, if I have to hammer a block of something, if I'm hammering out a Damascus billet or something, I really need to move that metal. For this, that can be a little bit of a problem. If you move too much metal too quick, you can end up either breaking a hole through your piece, punching a hole through it. A missed strike can be catastrophic, right? And we don't want to do that because this is little fine detail work. Some other hammers that are really good here. This is a planishing hammer. This is just a little teeny petting house, you know, planishing hammer. It has 2 faces on it. They're supposed to be polished. Oops, mine aren't right now. I'm bad. Sorry. But those are fairly inexpensive. Petting house hammers used to be really expensive, and they've come down significantly over the years. So I think for that, I paid like, I don't know, $30, $35, something like that. Other hammers that are really good. Tack hammers are amazing. There's a tack hammer that they currently have at Harbor Freight, if you have those in your area, that has a really long nose. I don't know where mine went, but I use it for absolutely everything. And it's garbage as a hammer. I mean, it's terrible. The metal is too soft and everything else, but the geometry of it lends itself to this stuff very, very, very well. So I have like a love-hate relationship with that hammer. If I need a specialty hammer, I make a specialty hammer, right? So this hammerhead I made out of what did I make this out of? 4140. So, you know, nice modern steel. It's really good for impact. I call this my mosquito. This is really good for getting in there, you know, when I need, you know, a little specialty thing. So I'll be using this a lot. But this is very similar to an inexpensive hammer that you can find just about anywhere. This is an automobile hammer. This is by Bondo, actually. This cost me $9.99. This is the greatest little, you know, hammer. But again, the steel is kind of garbage on this. It's not really that great, but it's got a good weight to it. The handle slides off. It's awesome. But the shape is really good. So primarily, you'll need a cross peen, a ball peen hammer, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and some kind of a planishing hammer. And often, if you don't have a planishing hammer, just use the other side of your ball peen. Just shine it up with a little bit of sandpaper to make sure you're not imparting any kind of, you know, if it has a ding or a cut or something in it. Every time you hit that, you're going to be pressing that pattern into your bronze, and we don't want to do that. All right. So now let's get going. So your first few strikes here when you're raising are pretty critical. So let me see if I can zoom in here. So I just got all my hammers. Here we go. So I only use on this little teeny corner of the pipe. You don't need anything more than this. I often see people as they start hitting their work, and I'm going to hit down at an angle like this, where they start doing this and they start striking down here. You're not going to raise anything like that. The process that we're doing is we're taking that little teeny edge that we're going to make, and as we hit it, we're going to keep pushing that down and down and down. You'll see in a second. It'll start to make sense. So to start, we need to define this foot that we have here. So the flat part that we have is purely just to get us going. So it's at this point, you have to line it up pretty well. And if you misstrike, you misstrike. That's okay. Sorry, I have my whole setup is a little bit different here. I had this set up so that I could do this on camera, and I normally sit a lot lower. Or sit my work is like down here, and I'm sitting up a lot higher. So I'm doing this kind of parallel in a way that I'm not used to. But anyway, okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to line my finger. Don't hit your finger, but I line my finger up on top of this, and then I'll bring the disc of bronze up. So I line it up approximately where I think that line is. And now when I strike, I'm striking here. That's the only strike you need. There's no fancy striking. You move the work. That's it. That's all you're doing. So I'm going to line this up, get it on the edge, go way back. And I can see I wasn't perfectly lined up. That's okay. This first part is the hard part. So now you see how I have a little shelf started? That little shelf, you're going to go all the way around, and we're going to define a very loose foot, and then we're going to do one complete pass all the way up this before we anneal. So once, good news, once you have that shelf started, you can just follow it around pretty easily. So again, I'm just striking down, trying to remain on camera and trying to make sure that I do this. So I'm going to misstrike a lot today. I apologize. I'll come up with a vessel by the end of it. So I learned this process while I was in undergrad at the Rhode Island School of Design. Really good school. I studied, when I was in graduate school, my graduate school advisor was a man named Jeffrey Clancy, who is just an amazing, amazing metalsmith. A few years back, he was part of a show at the Smithsonian. They had a 30 under 30 exhibit. He was that young, and he was that good. He teaches classes on metal raising in Germany and all over the world. He's really incredible metalsmith. Getting off track a little. Good thing is if you get off track, you can always correct it. And once you get this first pass, everything else kind of works itself out. So we can see here, I have a little bit of a misstrike. So I'm going to get that misstrike out.
Question.
Sure.
Your left hand, I know it needs to be there so that you can work it, but it's also making it where we can't see the strikes.
Oh, really? Here.
Yeah.
Let me move the thing around a little. Kind of like that. Is that a little?
Yeah, your thumb is coming up in the way.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah, I know.
That ends up being part of the process. If I can alter this a little. So let me move my butt back. So when this is coming down, is that a little bit better?
See that. We can see that now.
All right, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, if anybody sees anything like that, let me know, because it's kind of hard for me to judge what's going on the screen and what's going on in my hands simultaneously. So what I did to correct my misstrike is I just put it on the face, found the little shelf, and I just tapped that flat again, right? So Now I'm going to go through and I'm just going to define that edge a little more, and I'm going to keep going all the way up. All right. Let me get in a slightly more comfortable position. Hopefully we'll be able to see this. I apologize if it's a little off. All right. So when you're holding your hammer, you want to get a good grip. And now you can go in whichever direction you want, you know, like there are some people tell you, oh, you got to go clockwise, or you got to do this, or you got to do that. You got to do what's comfortable. Now we'll see how far I end up getting today. You know what, I gotta move this out a little bit more. I'm sure we'll get a candy dish anyway. I'm hoping that we get a beaker, but it just depends on how long I have. All right, so now I'm just gonna keep going. And don't worry if it's really rough. So, you know, as you're going along, we'll planish it. And the reason you do raising this way, you know, as I had said before, if you're dishing something, you'll end up expanding it in the middle. It's going to be prone to getting really messed up. I think at this point I need to anneal this. This is a little work hardened. So normally I would go all the way up, but I can feel there's a lot of resistance here, so I need to anneal this. So that'll give me a chance to kind of talk over what I'm doing. Where did I put my tongs? Work. So when you anneal bronze, you want to get it, you know, red, and the surface should start to change color. So you want it kind of like the surface should kind of go gray, or like a dull, kind of blackish sort of color. If anybody has ever done copper work, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. You know, but once you let it all go red, then you take it out, and unlike steel, you end up quenching it right away, and it keeps its annealed state. If you did that with steel, depending on the type of steel, right? If we were working with a medium carbon steel or high carbon steel, we would quench it. It would harden. Everything would crystallize and lock up. That's not the case with brass and bronze. So after we quench it, it will retain its annealed state, and we can keep going. You don't have to let it die down at room temperature. So which may seem a little counterintuitive, right? So you're going to see me go and quench it, and then, you know, I'll keep going from there. So like I said, I just have it heating up in my electric kiln right now, just so that way I'm not burning a torch and being really loud. This process can be a lot of fun though, and especially when you first get going, you know, there's a little bit of you know, of a back and forth and a little bit of a learning curve, but it's not that steep. It's a little bit more accessible than like investment casting. I'm going to leave that in just a little while longer. Get my water bucket. So I have my kiln set for around 1300 degrees. Bronze will melt somewhere around 1750, and I'll get a flow at like 1800, 1825, 1850, somewhere around there. So you want to keep it well below that. And in general, oh no, my backdrop, my messy shop, sorry. So you want to keep it well below that. Fortunately, most, like if you're using a MAP gas torch or something, although you can get something like that up to that melting point if you have it like corralled in and you have fire break and everything all around it. If it's open, you're not going to get this to the melting point. All right, so I just took this out. Can everybody see how this went from being yellow to black? It's like a dark black, kind of grayish color. It's really beautiful, actually. So now I'm just going to dip that in the water so I don't burn my hand. And now this is annealed. This is a lot softer. I can go ahead and bend this, not that I want to. So let's continue on with the raising process. I just grabbed whatever hammer was here, so I'm going to raise with this. I think I can get a little bit of a better angle for me being close in. And this may look a little different. This is a cobbler's hammer, but I'm still using that long flat edge. So I'm finding where I left off. Oh yeah, that's a lot better. The metal will tell you when it's time to anneal. I promise you that. You know, you'll be hitting it and it won't want to move. I mean, it's more critical to me when I'm making a helmet or something, you know, in steel, and I'm using big, you know, thick gauge, like 12 gauge steel or something. And it doesn't want to move, it becomes a bigger problem. But this, I can kind of force this. So I'm distorting my middle a little bit. This is like when I do a demo for one of my classes. So, you know, mundanely, you know, I'm a sculptor. You know, it's like my everyday kind of job. And so teaching sculpture, I mess up on my demos all the time. And then I get students that are like, are you sure you did that awesome quality work? But any teacher will know it's hard. It is very challenging to go through the process of a thing and talk at the same time. Actually, I do want my heavier hammer back. A little bit heavier. There we go. Okay. And so another reason we go through this raising process is you can make some really complicated and very, very beautiful shapes with this. You can, as you're raising this up, you can have a ball stake in front of you and you can sort of hammer it around a ball, and then you can get some really thin finger stakes and sort of come up with like light bulb shapes and, you know, some really, really incredible things. As you get.
By the way, to be aware of, when you're hammering, sometimes your voice gets covered up.
Oh, okay. Sure.
And the sound automatically mutes the hammering, but it mutes your voice too.
Okay. Great to know. Great to know. Thank you very much. So I have a little hat started, right? So I'm just going to keep going around. A lot of this process, now that I have the foot started, is going to be pretty similar.
Are you keeping the foot on the corner of the stake, or are you moving it toward you so you're still hammering on the corner of the stake?
So, so in general, you keep the foot on the corner of the stake. What I'm doing now, I'm doing this really, really crunched in. Generally, I'm a little bit more spread out and I have more control. And so I like to keep that foot right on the corner of the stake and then keep it going. But in trying to keep my hand at a weird sort of angle so that everybody can see what I'm doing, I'm kind of distorting the foot more than I usually do. And I'm having a hard time, you know, holding it like I normally would. But if I were doing this and I weren't being filmed, I would have the foot here. I'd be holding my hammer back here with an armorer's grip. You'd never see a blacksmith doing that, or very rarely would you see a blacksmith holding their thumb back here. It really affects this line on your wrist. But if you're sitting here and you're just tapping it, this is it. This should be the only motion that you do, and you move the work around the stake. So you move the foot around and you just keep it going and going and going. Did I answer your question? Was that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So And you can see I'm kind of breaking some of my rules as I'm going along. I'm kind of, if I see a spot I didn't get very good, I'm going back over it. So when this is done, this will yield a cup about the size of a normal coffee mug, like not one of my coffee mugs, but like a normal human coffee mug. I have giant, huge mugs. But, and then towards the end, once I have a vessel that's raised in a nice planish beaker, it's at that point I'll generally anneal the whole thing, and then I fill it with pitch. And once I have something that looks more like this, I can go through and then I can start to emboss and chase the outside. So you can come up with some very, very beautiful and elaborate patterns. It doesn't end up being a pure repousse, right? I'm not really, you know, I'm chasing the outside and kind of pushing the background back. So I'm pushing a little bit. But it's not that back and forth that you would usually see. But you enter into the repousse process and you can come up with something that's quite striking at the end. Douglas Pryor does a really, really lovely class on vessel raising and then repousse. He's repousséed some beautiful bronze vessels that he's turned into things like ram's heads and stuff. Just absolutely amazing. Amazing metal artist. All right. So I'm just going to go a little bit faster because I'm taking a look at the time and seeing what I have left. I'm just hoping that I can get through the entire dish. So I'm going to put this back in my oven and anneal it again. So that process, there's nothing you can do about it. That takes time. You're going to go back, you're going to anneal it, you're going to quench it, and then you're going to keep going. If you don't enter into that process, you're going to break it or you're going to break your hand. So that's just something that we end up being stuck with. How's everybody's day going? Good? Sorry, downtime while I'm waiting for the anneal process.
Are you going to be able to show us how to get rid of the wrinkles?
Yes,
Excellent.
I might end up switching over to a different piece to show that process. I had timed myself earlier, but I timed myself not being recorded. So it's taking me a little longer than I would normally take to do this.
Talk to us about left hand, in your case, holding hand. I'll
Sure.
do that. Damage, hurting.
Yes, yeah. It absolutely will. So I have a subluxed basal joint, and I can't do this for very long. I normally wear a brace in my everyday life. I went from being, you know, a fairly active master of arms and fighting in all of the tournaments to barely being able to hold my shield. And that is 20 years of raising and blacksmithing and metalsmithing and, you know, some bad genetics, you know, that
I'm at 64 now and have been fighting rattan for 30 some years. So
yeah, exactly.
Still only for the last 10 years.
Yeah, so I started fighting in 1999, you know, so I don't have that many years, but I have a few years anyway.
It hurts.
It's so frustrating going from, you know, going really deep in crown tournaments to, you know, I have to fight. I mainly fight longsword anyway now, but it's a big difference. So when you're doing this, so as you can see, I'm holding this a little bit weird too. It's just because of that basal joint. It's just stuck out. It's always subluxed. It doesn't go back in for me. So after this, I'm going to be icing my hand for the next 2 days. But, that's why I'm holding it like this. Normally, you would just have the heel of your hand, and you would have it pressed right there, and you wouldn't take this grip. You'd take something more like that grip. I can't control it like that anymore. You know, I've seen some people who just hold it at the bottom. And the better your initial foot is, the less likely this is going to be to rock and move and, you know, can't and do all that stuff that you don't want it to do. So the better you are at establishing that foot in a nice, good line in the beginning, the better it's all going to be a little bit later on. If that makes sense. All right. So I'm going to switch hammers to this guy really quick. I'm doing the exact same motion. I'm just going to progressively heavier and heavier hammers to try to get through the process a little bit faster so I can show you the end result. But so, and the other thing is, as you're moving it, you should be moving this back on the stake a little bit so that the point that you're raising should be the point that's on the edge. If that makes any sense at all to you. I'm just making a mess of the edge of this, but luckily we can go back and reset that afterwards. So if you drift, if you miss strike, it's okay. You can go back and you can fix that stuff. So now I've got the base of my cup coming up a little bit more. So I'm going to keep going and digging into this rotation. Normally, I can get through making a bowl in somewhere around 40 minutes to an hour, you know, because a bowl, you're essentially just doing 2 full passes and a lot less tight than I'm doing. So you're going to go back, and the more passes you do, the more you're going to tighten up those walls and the more vertical your piece is going to get. The less passes you do, it'll sort of start to come down and look a little bit more, it'll be more conical shaped. So it all depends on what you're trying to get, what your end result is. Which is why a little bit of design helps out at the beginning for sure, you know, in knowing what you want to do. I know some people that just go and they raise up a bunch of beakers just to have them. And then they just go and they start, you know, like decorating stuff that they have pre-made. You know, my work professionally, I have a lot of blades kicking around, as anybody who's been to my shop knows. You know, but I don't do these often enough to have these kicking around in my studio. My raising process generally is for helmets and elbow cups and that kind of thing. I specialize in 16th century armor through going to the Rhode Island School of Design. I was able to become acquainted with Jonathan Tavares, who's currently Associate Curator of Arms and Armor at Chicago Institute of Art. He also did the PBS special, Armor of the Shining Knight, so you can see him in there. And through meeting him, I got to do some really good work at the Metropolitan, going in and taking accurate weights and measures on 16th and 17th century swords predominantly, and then translating that into things that I make. So I'm getting more of a conical shape now. So my work on swords really led me down a much different path than I had been on previously. And I mean, you know, in the SCA, we have certain misconceptions that are really hard to break, you know, about swords and weights of swords, balance points of swords. So there's been some great scholarship recently on some of that stuff. Anyway, different class, sorry. So I'm going a little bit faster. I'm kind of, in order to save time, I've gone from this motion to this motion. I'm kind of pushing it out a little bit more. In general, you want to sort of avoid that motion because it's, you know, why, right? If this is here, if my finger is the metal, if I strike it, it's going to stretch the metal out rather than compress it. So whenever you strike metal, you are moving metal in some way. If you have a dome face hammer, like a ball peen or something, and you hit a flat sheet of metal, it's going to create a little tiny crater, a little tiny dimple right in the metal. When I'm using a flat hammer, I'm stretching that material out. So if I were like bladesmithing or something, you know, I would be hitting, you know, with this end to draw out a bar of steel. Here, though, I'm using this same process to go and compress that steel. I use the same process actually when I'm doing things like this. So this spearhead that I did, all of this is all traditional like forge welded methods. There is no modern mechanical welding anywhere on this piece. So it's like a forge welded socket. And then the head, you can see there's a joint there. The head is actually forge welded to the socket of that spear. This is the same process that I use to do that. I use to do a bowl. The exact same motion, the exact same movements. All right, where are we at for time? All right, I got about 10 minutes left. So by the end of this, again, this would be kind of a conical dish, and I would start in my second pass, and then I would bring that down and start to bring those edges in. So while that's annealing, I think let's switch over to the process of planishing. So let's say we got through raising something. So like I said, this is raised out of one sheet of steel, correct? So when you're looking at this lovely sallet skull, this skull was once a flat sheet, right? And so you can see it has all of those surface marks on there, you know, that really talk about its you know, the way that this was made. There was a lovely exhibit at the Met, you know, last year that was the Arms and Armor of Maximilian, right? And there was a suit there that I believe was made for Charles V, and that suit had it was unfinished, and it had all of the original hammer marks all over the suit everywhere. And for a metalsmith, it was amazing to see exactly how they went and did some of those rolls and flutes and other things, right? So it's like on my gauntlets, that same raising process. I don't know if you can see, but the cuffs on my gauntlets are not straight. They're trumpet shaped. They flare out. So the same process that I use to raise a cup is the same process that I use to raise a helmet top, is the same process that I use to create a trumpet shape on my gauntlets. It's just how you adapt that. You know, it's the same process that I use on the sockets of my spears and polearms. So learning that process takes a little bit of time, but you know, you can see from just starting that out today how that process continues on. So once you have a finished object or a roughed in object, we move on to a planishing stake. In my case, I use this ball stake right here. Can everybody see that? So these are commercially available all over the place. This is basically just a big old ball bearing on top of a like a dog leg piece of steel, and I have this set in a stump. Now, to get a really nice smooth finish, you want to start with finely polished tools. This is not. My hammers are not. Modern armorers have a tendency to hammer something really fat, and then they go back in with grinders and they grind it all out afterwards. And largely they end up doing that because of all of the mechanical modern welds that they have in there. They have to kind of fare those welds out and make it appear as though it's all out of one piece. Now, when you actually make something out of one piece, in order to get that nice, smooth finish, it's better to go in and planish, because that process of raising and sinking and moving the metal around means that you're going to have a few inconsistencies. I mean, we're talking thousandths of an inch.
So, you know, we're not talking like huge, giant, like carpentry measurements. We're talking about machinist measurements, but those can make all the difference when you're polishing. So Robert McPherson had a really fantastic thread on Armor Archive, for anybody that knows that website, where he was going through and he was using a modern grinder to finish some of his work, and he had sanded through in like one spot on one of his pieces, and then he just remade it. He's wonderful, amazing, a little nuts, but you got to be nuts to do this stuff. So what I'm going to do now is the same thing that I was doing on the steak. So when I'm hitting this, I'm hitting one spot, and you're moving the work around. Don't move your hammer all squirrely, right? The reason you don't want to do that is this way you have muscle memory built up. You have all of, you know, your power is focused on one hit, right? Repetitive motion. And so you're going to get a predictable outcome. The problem with, you know, going all over the place is you're going to get an unpredictable outcome. And in doing that, you're going to have, you know, an unpredictable final result. It might be great. It likely will not. So the process of planishing, this really should go through a process called bouging, which is where you're eliminating the big lumps. But we're going to jump right to planishing because it's more applicable to the raising process. But where you go through and you find those dents, you find those lumps in there, and you want to make everything nice and even. Now, the process of planishing, it is better to use chalk or soapstone, which I have here. And you want to run that sideways, right? Now I can see all of the high spots and all of the low spots, right? See all of the areas where the chalk hit or the soapstone hit, and I'm running this flat across. So now in order to make this flat, I'm going to go through with my hammer and I'm going to find the dents. And I'm going to slowly move that around the steak. Now the hammer is flat, the steak is round. So the part that is going to be doing the shaping is actually the steak, not the hammer. The hammer is pressing your work up against the steak. The steak is imparting its geometry into your piece, if that makes sense to people. So I've gone through and I made that spot that was flat round. Now, in order to go and really planish an entire piece, hours. I mean, this helm top, for me to go through and really planish this, I am going to be working at planishing this. So that's why modern armor makers and modern smiths, you know, they make it out of steel. They just use dies or, you know, buy prefab tops, weld them together and grind it. And they get kind of a predictable, you know, result because of that. That's why a lot of modern armor sort of looks similar. You know, if you look at something from any of the big, you know, armor sellers in the United States, all of it looks pretty similar, right? But most of their parts were all purchased from the same two people, right? That make helm tops and armor parts and stuff. And then, you know, it gets sent to different armor workshops, and then they get assembled there. So they get welded and put back together. We all do it. Every single person in the industry does it. And if they say they don't, they're lying. But not very many people do this type of work where they're raising it up from one piece. What this allows me to do is, so if I was wearing this piece, right? Look at the back of this. Look at the sweep of that. There's a telltale sign when you're looking at modern armor that it was assembled and, you know, kind of welded together. Normally the backs are really flat, and that's because the armor is assembled from three pieces. You have two skull halves that are welded together, and then there's a skirting piece that's welded on the back. Most people's skirting patterns are fairly straight up and down, and indeed, often those skirting pieces are riveted on, you know, in case of spoggins and stuff. So when you're looking at a helm that's been worked over, there's some really amazing folks that are making armor today. I'll give a shout out to Cliffside Armory. You know, certainly Enzo there will fabricate his helmet using certain, modern methods like can house method, and we can get into that later, but where it's a welded construction, and then you go through afterwards and you use these same raising principles to shape the helmet after it's welded together to make it seamless. You even, hammer your weld lines down and stuff to give it more of this kind of shape. Anyway, I digress. So when you're starting with this kind of shape, it's easier to go through and planish it. I don't have a weird weld spot that I'm a little bit worried about cracking if I hit it like too hard or at the wrong angle. And I don't have like, any kind of like crazy seams that might not line up perfectly. It's all one piece of metal. So when I'm planishing, I can just go through, find the spot, move the piece around, and then run your hands over the top of it. When you run your hands over the top of it, close your eyes. Your eyes will lie to you. Your eyes will tell you, oh, it's perfect, it's finished, it's done. Your fingers will find every divot and groove and every little mess up part of that. And then you can go through and just hammer it until it feels good. So you have to use all of your senses when you're planishing at the end of it. And it's the same thing when you're planishing your cup. So when we planish a raised vessel, like a cup or a bowl, we're going to be planishing on our stake. So notice on my pipe stake that I made here, I have two faces, right? The reason I didn't make this an elbow is because I want this nice clean surface over here for planishing afterwards. I have this surface for all the rough, crazy, brutal hammer work that I end up doing. But let's say I had gotten to the end of raising my cup, and then I'm going to be planishing my cup. I can show you the process in the air, and you might get as much or more out of it than if I had a piece in between. So my planishing hammer, flat face, supposed to be polished. I'm a bad smith. Mine is not polished. And we're going to pretend that this is nice and polished too. So I want to come down flat. I don't want to come down at an angle because we remember the face of this hammer is perfectly flat. If I come in at even a slight angle, I'm going to impart a crescent shape into the surface. So I need this to be flat, and flat that rides over the arc of my stake. Does that make sense to everybody? Right? So I'm only really hitting in the middle. So when I'm planishing, I'm generally standing over. That's my motion. And if I had, here's a lovely old Starbucks cup that will be our proxy for a raised vessel. So if I'm planishing this, this is what I'm doing, mechanically going around in circles. If we have any machinists out there, you know about step over. So step over of the tool. So if a tool is coming down and cutting and lifting up and cutting, next to it, you're cutting, you're overlapping the diameters of the tool. It's the same thing with step over on your hammer strokes. You're not hammering, turning, hammering, turning, hammering, turning. Each hammer stroke should slightly overlap the previous hammer stroke. So it's little micro adjustments, and you're just going all the way down the vessel, moving it, not your hammer, until you get to the end. And then you're finding all of the divots that you missed the first time. And you're going all the way back up, smoothing all of those back out till you get to the end. And then you're going to take your lovely soapstone and you're going to find your low spots, and you're going to go through, and then you're going to target all of those and adjust until you have a perfectly smooth cup or vessel at the end of it, or bowl, or whatever it is you're trying to make. If you were making a bowl, let's pretend that this is my bowl. Remember how I told you don't do that? Now it's time to do that, right? So you've raised it. It's the shape that it's going to be. You will rest it so that the largest section, the largest flat section is against your stake. And you'll go through, and the same process, you'll turn it and overlap your hammer strokes until it's nice and smooth. If your piece required a specialty stake, let's say I was raising a light bulb shape, for example, A light bulb stake or a light bulb shape will require some specialty stakes that kind of come in. This is a piece of Damascus, but the shaping is similar. That will come in, come up, and will have a little polished face here. So that if my hand is the vessel, when this comes in, I have something that I can hammer against and make this round that I can then disengage and take out of the front of the vessel afterwards to ensure that my piece doesn't get stuck. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't get through a complete vessel in the time frame that I had, but I will post pictures of the finished vessel up on the Facebook page afterwards so that people can see kind of what I was doing.
Can you take about 3 minutes and address getting the wrinkle out of the edge?
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. Thank you for reminding me. So let me see. What's the easiest way to do this? Let me go grab a piece of metal and I'll put a wrinkle in the edge and then we'll talk about that. Sorry, I'm off screen just for 1 second. So this is really nice and annealed now. Quench, bring it back up. This is really what you want. So I put it in and it was so hot that all of the stuff like flaked off. I can bend this with my hands now. So here I have this big wrinkle. So the process of raising this takes the wrinkles out as you go. So try not to get this on my Mac here. So if you look, I have a wrinkle right here. And then I have the spot that I stopped raising right here. If I can get some light on it, you'll notice that the wrinkle starts to unwrinkle as I move out towards the edge. So the real answer is don't worry about it. Go all the way to the edge. It's not going to get worse as you continue to raise your vessel. And that's why we call it raising, right? Because you're raising it off. So the process of raising will eliminate those. If you have a really deep wrinkle and you're worried for whatever reason about it, you can put it down and you can sort of bang it out a little bit. But only once you've gone through the annealing process. Do not try to bang out a wrinkle if it is if it's work hardened, because you're going to get a crack that's going to come up here and it's going to ruin your lovely cup. Right? So does that make sense? Don't worry about the wrinkles. They'll work themselves out. If you're really worried about them, give them a nice tap and they should just come out once you've annealed it. Anybody else have another question? Comment? No? All right. Well, so what I'm going to do then, it was very lovely to speak to everybody today. I get to talk about a topic that I adore. I mean, I would do this all day if I could. And indeed, I do this all day. This is actually my mundane job. But it doesn't seem like I'm going to get a full vessel done in the time that we have. But I will continue to work on this, and then I will forward pictures of the final raised vessel so everybody can see towards the end of it. Okay. Anybody else have any questions, comments? Would it be possible just to leave this room up for a little while I'm working on this, and then I can sign off after, Kira?
Absolutely. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.